Hey everybody, this is Russ Metro Game Core. Today we're going to do a comparison between the AYN Thor and the AYANEO Pocket DS. These two handhelds are very similar in many ways. They are high-end dual-screen Android-based devices. And one of the main questions I've been getting over the past couple months is which one do I think is better? So we're going to break up this video in a bunch of different categories and tackle them one by one. And as we jump into it, I've got two main caveats. The first is that I've already done impressions and in-depth reviews of each of these devices. I will leave it all linked down below. So we're going to approach this video as if you've already watched all the nitpicking that I've done for each of these devices in those videos. And the second caveat is that this is mostly going to be my own subjective opinion. After all, it's going to be talking about what I prefer one over the other. And my goal here is to give you as much objective information as possible so that you can make up your own mind as well, even if I have my own preferences. So let's go ahead and dive in. What I'll do with each of these categories is assign them a letter grade, and that letter grade will correspond to a number, and then we'll tally all of that at the end. That being said, the first category is the price, and I'm not going to assign a letter grade to this one. Instead, we're just going to talk about the actual price point and what it actually means. And the price range for the Thor starts at around $250 and goes up to $430 plus shipping. By contrast, the AYANEO Pocket DS is more expensive. It starts at $400 and goes all the way up to $640. So let's talk about what that money will get you for each product. Let's start with the AYANEO Pocket DS. The starting price here is $399, but it is worth noting that the specs and the pricing is really dependent on the color model that you choose. Let's start with their black model, which is the one that starts at that $400 price point. It comes with 8 GB of RAM and 128 gigs of storage. And this model can be upgraded. You can get 12 gigs of RAM and double the storage for an additional $40. And if you're willing to spend up to $500, you can get the black model with 16 gigs of RAM and 512 gigs of storage. Now the other two models, yellow and gray, can only be purchased at the highest end tier, which means that if you want the yellow model, like the one that I'll be showing off in this video, its only price is $600. Now you are getting a lot of specs for that price. You're getting 16 gigs of RAM and a terabyte of internal storage, but still, you don't have the option to get this one for $400. And same thing with their retro gray model. This one only comes at the highest tier, and for some reason, this one's even more expensive than the yellow model. It's $640 for that same 16 gigs of RAM and 1 terabyte of storage. And this is something I talked about in the review, in that I don't really like the fact that there's a $200 price difference if you want any color other than black. Now I think the black color still looks decent, and I think probably most people are going to be ordering that one, but man, I really like the yellow one, and I wish they offered this one for the $400 price tier as well. Now the Thor starts out at a significant cheaper price, but there are some caveats here too. The $250 cheapest price is what they call the light model. This one actually has a lower powered CPU. It's got the Snapdragon 865, the same chip in the Retroid Pocket 5. And like I mentioned in my Thor review, I don't really recommend this model at all, because for only $50 more, you can get the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2, which is several times more powerful than the Snapdragon 865. And so really, for the purpose of this video, I'm kind of thinking of the AYN Thor as a starting price of $300, just because the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 is very similar in performance to the AYANEO Pocket DS, so that's more apples to apples. Now AYN does that same thing where they have one single color at the lowest price tier, and so that $300 model only comes in black. If you upgrade to the Pro model, which comes with 12 gigs of RAM and 256 gigs of storage, then the price goes up to $350, but you get all the color options that you would like. And they've got 4 color options here. I think each of them are great, but my favorite is the tan or the 16-bit one, which is the one we'll be using in this video. In addition, if you want to go the full Monty and get 16 gigs of RAM and a terabyte of storage, that will increase the price as well to $429. And so pound for pound, when it comes to price, I think the Thor is at a big advantage here, just because it starts out at a cheaper price, and even if you get it at the fully spec'd out Max model, which has 16 gigs of RAM and a terabyte of storage, it's only $30 more than the base AYANEO Pocket DS. And so for many people, I think the price might be a major factor. There is a big difference between what you can get with your money for the Thor versus the Pocket DS. But of course, there are all the other categories that we need to talk about next. The next major category is the size and the weight, and there is a huge difference between these two. They both are kind of similar in the fact that they are clamshells, but when you compare them side by side, there is a huge difference between the two. The Thor weighs 367 grams versus the AYANEO Pocket DS, which is 532. That's about a 45% difference between them. And I found that the difference in size and weight makes a huge difference in how I actually play each of these devices. To me, the Thor is small enough to be pocketable, like it is something that I can take around with me. In fact, I went on a trip to Japan a few weeks back and I took it with me, and it was the perfect travel companion because it's a clamshell, which means that, it's going to protect the controls on the screen when you close it up, which makes it very travel friendly. And I found it to be the perfect travel size where I could throw it in my sling bag or even in my pocket, and it still wouldn't take up that much space. By contrast, the AYANEO Pocket DS feels too big to be an actual Android gaming device. It feels more like a handheld PC. This thing is so big and heavy. I can stick it in some pockets, but it is not comfortable, not something I would want to walk around with, and so I don't really find this one to be as portable friendly. Instead, I find the AYANEO Pocket DS to be more of a home/couch device, something that, I'll take around the house and really enjoy its larger screen and the nice ergonomic controls that we'll talk about later, but it's not necessarily something that I would chuck in a bag and then take around with me. In other words, it kind of feels like a Thor is a more spontaneous gaming handheld because I'm more apt to take it with me because of its smaller size, which means that I'll have it with me in times when I might want to play a game, whereas the AYANEO Pocket DS is really more deliberate, something that I would have at the house and then open up when I'm ready for a big gaming session. When you compare it in size to a DSi XL, you kind of get an idea of where these all fall out, where the Thor is a little bit thicker but kind of smaller as well, and then also you have the Pocket DS, which is just bigger in every single way. And so I think the size and the weight is a really big distinguishing factor as well for potential buyers, because do you want a handheld that's going to be more portable that you can take around with you on the go very easily, or do you want something that's bigger and more deliberate and with larger screens? So that's kind of the big distinction here. So when it comes to grading this category, I ended up giving the AYANEO Pocket DS an A because it is still a very compact handheld for the amount of size and screen that you're going to be getting, which we'll talk about later. But I do think that the AYN Thor just kind of hits it a little bit better because it is a device that I can take around with me on travel very easily, but then it also kind of works at home in like a couch-friendly setup too. I guess the way I'm looking at it is if you're looking for something to recreate that 3DS experience, then the Thor is an easy choice. But if you want something that's a much more bigger and upgraded experience, then the AYANEO Pocket DS is also an excellent choice. Okay, next we'll talk about overall design, and we'll take a quick look at each of them and then compare them against each other. So starting with the Thor here, like I mentioned, it does feel very reminiscent of a 3DS, but upgraded to a 2025 spec. Beyond just the size and weight of it, it has a very curved design to it that is somewhat reminiscent of Nintendo products as well. The hinge design and feeling is also very similar to a DS, where it kind of locks in these certain positions, and so yeah, it kind of feels like a 3DS all around. It does have some unique aspects to it, like this all-glass front, and then of course it's got a modern control scheme. And I think just in terms of overall looks, I think it's a lot cleaner on the AYN Thor. We've got like this nice control scheme that makes a lot of sense, it's very symmetrical, and so yes, I think it's a beautifully made handheld. My only major design complaint about the Thor is that glass front can get kind of reflective and shiny, especially with the black model. Now I have the 16-bit model now, and I much prefer this one just because it's not so apparent. But that was definitely an issue I had with the black model when I was playing it outdoors, that yeah, this thing was quite reflective. Now I do think that the AYANEO Pocket DS is a beautifully designed handheld as well. We've got these nice ergonomic bumps on the back, and it's just kind of chunky looking. The front right here, like this top part, is actually a glass plate, and so it feels really nice and cool to the touch. It's a very elegant handheld on its own. The hinge on this one's a little bit different. It's more stiff, and so it kind of can go in any angle, and it doesn't click until you get to 180 degrees. So you can kind of position it anywhere that you want. Now, in terms of design, I still think this one is very impressive, mostly because of these massive displays, but I think the overall just look of it and design is a little bit busier. We've got all these buttons around the edges, and it's kind of confusing to know which button does which. For example, these are your volume up and down, these are your start and select, and then these are like random menu buttons. It doesn't make a lot of sense to me just from a natural perspective. There's also some things about this design that seem really off, like the really small analog sticks, which we will talk about in the control section too. But all the same, I think those are minor complaints on a device that is very impressive on its own. We've got just these massive displays here and a really cool design overall. So I'm not really saying this is a bad design, but rather it's just not quite as simple and as elegant as the AYN Thor. So looking at them side by side, it is kind of crazy because yes, they are both dual screen handhelds, but they are unique in their own way. And between the two, I think they are both really well designed, but I do like the cleanness of the AYN Thor all around. And so in terms of grading here, it's a very similar experience where I think they're both good, but the AYN Thor pulls ahead a little bit. So I'm going to give that one a higher grade. Okay, next up, let's talk about the controls, and I went into detail with each of these in the review, so I'm just going to give a quick overview. The most important thing to me about the controls with the Thor is that they are tried and true. We've seen these sticks in other AYN products, same thing with the D-pad, and even the face buttons are very similar too. So really, there are no surprises when it comes to these controls. They are excellent analog sticks, good D-pad, good face buttons, and I don't really have any complaints about how it feels overall in terms of how these controls work. The D-pad is a dome switch, kind of like a PS Vita. The analog sticks are Hall sensors and have a nice range of motion to them and really nice stick caps on them. And then the face buttons are rubber membrane, so they have a nice kind of classic feel to them, and they don't have too much travel on them either. So I think overall the controls are excellent. The only thing keeping these controls from being perfect in my eyes are these trigger buttons, which I think are a little bit sharp on the edges and should have been rounded a little bit more, because as I press down on them, they just don't feel very good. So I would have liked to have seen a redesign on these triggers, but everything else is really good. Now for the Pocket DS, I think these controls are still good, but a little bit strange overall. The analog stick components are the same as the AYN Thor, so it feels good and controls nicely, but the caps are very different. They're much smaller and not as grippy. Thankfully, the caps can be pulled off and replaced. In fact, you could put the Thor caps on top of these and it would actually work. So it is unfortunate that these sticks are so small, but thankfully it is fairly easy to fix. There are even options on Etsy that you can buy yourself. Now the D-pad and the face buttons are very shallow and clicky. At first I thought they were dome switches, but I think they're actually micro switches with some padding to them. And yeah, there's not a lot of travel to them, but they are accurate. My only complaint here is that they feel very modern and not quite retro. And so if you are going to be playing, some more older systems, it does feel kind of like a disconnect. And so I really don't have any complaints about these buttons in general, just the fact that there is a bit of a disconnect between how they feel and the games you might be playing. Between the shoulders and triggers, I think that these triggers are actually better than they are on the Thor, but these are also much thicker grips, so they had more room to work with. And so I think that might be part of the issue as well. But in general, I would say that yes, these triggers are easy to use and softer on the fingers than the actual Thor. So that's probably one thing that is a big advantage. But one pet peeve of mine on the AYANEO Pocket DS is that the start and select buttons are down here, and that's a very uncomfortable and weird position for them. I would much rather have them, somewhere up here. It's just a more natural place for your thumbs. Instead, it feels kind of jarring to have to go down here to press either of these two menu buttons, and sometimes I confuse them and think that these are start and select, or maybe one of these are going to be, and so it's just kind of a weird control setup altogether. Again, the buttons themselves are not bad, but the placement of them is a little bit strange. And so again, between the two, I think it's pretty similar, where they are both good, although they each have their own flaws, but I do prefer the AYN Thor controls just because they feel a lot better in the hand, and I also like the placement of the start and select buttons. So in terms of grading here, I'm going to knock them both down a little bit just because of their inherent flaws, but I'm going to give a B to the AYANEO Pocket DS and then an A to the AYN Thor. Okay, so next I want to talk about ergonomics, and I think that they are both good and bad at the same time. So let's start with the AYANEO Pocket DS. Now, this one has these really nice, comfortable ergonomic grips on the back, and so I really do like the feel of this thing in my hands just because it really cups nicely. I've got a lot of space for my fingers, and so it does feel good to hold this thing in general. The problem with this one is that the screen is so large, and we've got these pretty chunky bezels as well, that we've got basically no space for the controls on each side, so they are just in a straight line on each end. And it does make a kind of weird experience. We've got this big roomy back, but then this really squished and cramped front. And so that's been my major complaint about this, is that it's this weird dichotomy between a comfortable handheld, but then cramped controls. Now the Thor is kind of an opposite experience because they have a flat back to it. So there are no ergonomic bumps here. It's just kind of flat like an old 3DS. And that makes it super portable. Obviously it gets a lot smaller, but then also we don't have those ergonomic bumps on the back to kind of help offset the overall weight. But on the other hand, the Thor has a smaller screen on the bottom that is also a taller aspect ratio, which gives you more space for the controls, and so it feels a bit more comfortable to use the face buttons altogether. It's still a relatively cramped experience. My thumbs naturally want to have these controls down here, but obviously they are closer outside, and so this is not quite as comfortable as it could be just because of that second screen. And so ergonomically, I think that neither of these are perfect, and there's going to be compromises either way. Either you're going to have something that's a bit bulkier, but then more cramped in the front because of that larger screen with the AYANEO Pocket DS, or you're going to have the Thor, which is, a little bit more comfortable on the front, but doesn't have those ergonomic bumps on the back to help offset that weight. And so in terms of grading, I'm going to give them both a C, just because there are inherent compromises and flaws with a clamshell form factor in ergonomics specifically. There are a lot of positives to having a clamshell, but it comes with its own set of drawbacks. Now, one of the great things about the Thor is that they sell their own ergonomic grips for $15 on their website, and these just slide right in. And yeah, this will improve the overall ergonomics a lot. In fact, this kind of feels more like the AYANEO Pocket DS. And so if you are willing to use a TPU grip, then yes, this feels more comfortable to me than the AYANEO Pocket DS, and I would probably bump up the grade to a B, but out of the box, I'm going to give them both a C, and then you will have to spend that extra $15 if you want to improve the ergonomics on the Thor. Unfortunately, AYANEO does not sell grips for their device, but I'm sure there will be 3D printed options available on Etsy at some point. Okay, moving along, let's talk about these screens, and I think this is going to be a bit more contentious and possibly subjective. Let's go ahead and tackle this one screen at a time. So the AYN Thor has a 6-inch 1080p 120Hz display, whereas the AYANEO Pocket DS has a 7-inch 1080p 165Hz OLED panel. The AYANEO also has a higher peak brightness of 800 nits compared to 650 on the AYN Thor. So right there, just based on the specs, you can see that there is a difference. One is bigger, one is going to have a higher refresh rate, and then also it gets brighter. And comparing the two side by side when it comes to content, that 1 inch of additional size does make a huge difference. I found that just in general, as I'm playing the Thor, it's fine. Like, it's a good 6-inch size, but when I pick up the AYANEO Pocket DS, I'm like, holy smokes, this thing is so big and beautiful compared to the other. And they're both excellent displays with really good contrast ratio and coloring and vibrance, but in general, I have found that the AYANEO one is just more impressive. A higher refresh rate, it's a larger display, and it also does have a higher brightness. When I look at them outdoors at both at 100% brightness, I can see that the AYANEO Pocket DS is slightly brighter. Now, both of these I think are outdoor friendly. I can play these no problem. Even in direct sunlight, I can still see what's going on with the top screen. And so the AYANEO Pocket DS to me does have a slight advantage here, but they are both acceptably bright. Now, the bottom screens are probably a more stark contrast between the two. On the AYN Thor, this one is 3.92 inches with a resolution of 1240 by 1080 and a peak brightness of 550 nits, and it is an OLED panel. This one also has a unique aspect ratio of 31 by 27, which gives it kind of a squarish look. Now, the AYANEO Pocket DS has a larger bottom display. This one is 5 inches, an aspect ratio of 4 by 3, and a resolution of 1024 by 768. So this is lower resolution than the OLED panel on this one. This one is also not OLED, it is an LCD. Like with the Thor, it says it has 550 nits of peak brightness, but I found that when comparing the two, there is a huge difference. So here I am outdoors again at max brightness, and you can see that the AYN Thor is a lot easier to see in daylight. And if we actually go into direct sunlight, you can see that the AYANEO is almost impossible to see, whereas the AYN Thor is clearly more visible. So I think in terms of quality of display, I do definitely prefer the Thor. It's got a nice color balance to it. I think that this one is a little bit too warm and yellow looking, and this one is also much more saturated looking too, and has a better contrast ratio. So to look at, I do think that the Thor is better than the AYANEO. But I think when it comes to actually playing games, the AYANEO has a clear advantage in those larger displays that are at a more fitting aspect ratio. So obviously the top screen is going to be larger, and you can see there's a big difference between the two in terms of size, but then also on the bottom screens is a big difference as well, because this one has a true 4:3 aspect ratio. Systems like 3DS and DS are going to fit naturally with it, whereas with the Thor, you're going to have those black bars at the top and bottom. And whether or not this bothers you is going to be a personal preference, but for me personally, I do think that the AYANEO Pocket DS does look better. Now, like I showed in my AYANEO Pocket DS video, the difference between the OLED and the LCD display is stark in some ways. If you're playing the same content at the same time on both displays, you can definitely see a difference between the two. But for the most part, if you are going to be using a dual screen setup, you're never really going to see the same thing at the same time. And so for me, the difference between OLED and LCD is something that kind of bothered me on paper, but when I saw it in person, I was like, this is actually fine because it's not the same thing most of the time. If I had to classify one over the other, either the OLED and LCD difference on the AYANEO versus the AYN Thor and having those black bars because of the weird aspect ratio on this bottom display, I would say that the aspect ratio thing actually bothers me more than on the AYANEO Pocket DS, because this just feels like a more natural fit, and the LCD and OLED difference doesn't really matter to me. Now, one concern I've seen from buyers is that an LCD panel on the AYANEO Pocket DS will have light bleed compared to something like the Thor, which obviously has that OLED OLED panel where you're not going to see that. And I've seen some images floating around where it looks pretty heinous on their devices, but on my unit, I really haven't seen it at all. So even with the brightest setting on the bottom display and with the studio lights off, I'm not really seeing any sort of light bleed either. You can see that this part is brighter than the others, but I think that has to do with like the background image they're using with this particular setup. And so personally, I think it looks just fine. On the other hand, if you are concerned about light bleed on your panel, that's something that will really bother you, then, getting an OLED display like on the Thor will probably be a little bit better. But at least with the unit that I have here for testing, I'm not seeing any big difference. And so in grading the two, I think they are both excellent. They have their own strengths and weaknesses, and it really depends on what you prefer. But between the two, I would say that I prefer the AYANEO Pocket DS. The screens are larger, and the bottom screen has a true 4:3 aspect ratio, which is a really good fit for most of the stuff you're going to be playing. Okay, now let's move on to audio. We're going to do a test between these two, and we're also going to try two different games. Okay, so my gut reaction here is that they both sound pretty good, but I think that the Pocket DS probably has better speakers, although they do feel a little bit muffled, like they lack some high end. I think because we have a larger shell, the low end is a lot richer, and so I think that sounds better to me. By contrast, I think the Thor has maybe a bit more balanced sound. It doesn't sound as muffled, but it feels a little bit flat, and I think that's because the bass is weak and everything else just kind of mushes together. So again, I think they both sound pretty good, but they each have their own characteristics to them. Now, one great thing about the AYANEO Pocket DS is in their system settings, you can go in and actually use an equalizer to change out the audio profile if you would like. This is not something that they have in the AYN Thor settings. And so I think this is a big advantage here that you can adjust the audio to your own liking to make it sound even better or at least more personalized. So in terms of grading here, I would say that neither are perfect. I would probably give them both a B out of the box, but the fact that we have a graphic equalizer in the AYANEO settings does give it a bit of an advantage. So I'm going to give that one an A. Let's talk about software next. We'll start with the AYANEO Pocket DS, and in general, these are going to work the same way. You're going to have access to both screens anytime you want, so you can launch a game either at the top or the bottom. You can do multitasking. All that stuff's going to work on each handheld. Each of them also have the ability to go into the software and be able to turn off one screen or the other, so all that is going to work between the two. The AYANEO software feels a lot more robust. You've got all these options down below, like the dual screen options, the ability to go to the applications and launch a game from down here. You've got a task manager too if you want to clear out any games that you don't want to have running, and you've got a control panel. So this will open up the ability to change the brightness for either display and to change the volume. A couple distinctions here worth noting is that this only has one universal volume toggle. So if you have two things going at once, like a video and a game, this is going to increase and decrease the volume for each of them at the same time. Now, beyond just these settings, you can also press the AYANEO button. It'll bring up even more options. So we can change out our performance profiles or monitor how the system is running. And then you can swipe over as well, change out your ABXY pattern, or maybe have some hotkeys right here too. So this one's a little bit more complicated and robust, given that we have these options down below, and then you can press the AYANEO button to get to these ones as well. So there's just many different screens to manage your handheld. By contrast, the AYN Thor is a much more simple experience. By default, you're just going to see two screens, so you can either navigate up here to get up to all your apps, or you can navigate down here to get to the same apps. And other than that, you've just got one single AYN button, which will bring up this menu right here. And within there are a couple different things you can do. For example, under the mode section, this is where you can change out your screen brightness. You can also change out your volume, and you do have the ability to change the volume either for the top or the bottom screen. So you have a mixture that you can do. Beyond that, we've also got a task manager, so if you want to close out of any app, you can do that really quickly. And then also you have the ability to go into the settings section. So here is kind of your home base. This one has a lot of the other features that we saw in the AYANEO software, but all just in one little place. So here we can change out our performance profile by tapping on it. We can change out our fan or our Xbox ABXY style. All that is done just on this one single display. Another big advantage of this software compared to the AYANEO as of making this video is that we can toggle on 120 FPS mode. The thing about having two screens on Android is that they're going to be limited to the refresh rate of the lowest performing screen, which means that this one is 60 Hertz, and so by default it should be 60 Hertz for each. But AYN has figured out a way to actually make the top screen 120 Hertz while keeping the one down below 60 Hertz. I talk about this in the review video. Now, unfortunately, it does cause screen tearing on this screen if you are doing something that's fast moving, like scrolling through something really quickly. But in general, I found that in just my regular use case, I've never really experienced it. So you can run 120 Hertz while having both screens on with this handheld. With the AYANEO Pocket DS, if you have both screens going at once, you're going to be limited to 60 frames per second on the top display, no matter what. So there's no workaround like it is on the Thor. Now, I fully expect that at some point, AYANEO will probably develop that with their software because a lot of these companies kind of mimic one another. But at the same time, right now, you can only play 60 Hertz with both screens on this device. So for me, the software experience is pretty close between the two, but there are some clear advantages for the Thor, like the 120 FPS mode, or the fact that we can actually change out the volume for each individual screen. And so I do put this one a little bit ahead of the AYANEO. It's much simpler, and it also just kind of works. And so I'm going to give an A to the AYN Thor and a B to the AYANEO Pocket DS. I think they both have some room for improvement, for example, fixing the screen tearing on the AYN Thor, but as it stands right now, I think the Thor has a clear advantage. Now let's talk about performance between the two, and it's almost neck and neck. The Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 in the AYN Thor and the Snapdragon G3X Gen 2 on the AYANEO Pocket DS are essentially the same. The G3X Gen 2 does run at a higher clock speed. And when running a 1-minute benchmark like Wildlife Extreme, you can see that there is a pretty big advantage here between the AYANEO Pocket DS and the AYN Thor. We're looking at 4285 versus 3669. Now, if we do a 20-minute Wildlife Extreme stress test between the two, this is where things get a little bit more similar. The Thor's top score was 3665, which is in line to that 1-minute test that we did. And then same thing here with the AYANEO, it's 4279, which again is very close. But looking at the lowest loop score really shows us more information. With the Thor, it's 3476, giving us a stability of 94.8%. But on the AYANEO Pocket DS, it's 3761, and the stability is much lower, 87.9. So if we look at the test minute by minute, you can see that yes, that first minute on the AYANEO Pocket DS is really high. It boosts it up to 4279, but then it immediately drops and then it just keeps going down until it averages about 4775 or so. And so that's more of the score that you're going to get over a longer gaming session. It's going to even out at about 10 minutes. And the Thor does a similar thing where it starts out really high and then goes down, but it doesn't dip down by much. It's 3658, and then it evens out around 3580. And so the major difference between the two is only about 200 points when you do an actual in-game test like this, when you're playing for longer than 1 minute. And so this all makes sense to me. This one's running at a higher clock speed, so it does have a little bit better performance, but it's not by that much. So moving over to Geekbench 6 and their CPU benchmark, this is going to be a better indicator of emulation performance because emulation is usually going to be CPU intensive and mostly going to be focused on a single core score. And you can see that single core between the two is almost identical. Same thing with multi-core. In fact, it's a little bit faster on the Thor. And so for me, this is kind of a wash. When it comes to CPU intensive tasks, they're about the same. The bigger advantage is going to be the GPU test in Geekbench 6 running the Vulkan test here. You can see it's much higher on the AYANEO Pocket DS, but that's because this is a shorter test, which means that first minute when it boosts really high, that's where it's capturing all of this data. So again, this also makes a lot of sense to me in that this one has a higher score because it's a shorter test. Okay, let's do a couple real-world tests. Let's do God of War on PS2 here, running the exact same app, Nether SX2, exact same settings. So we're running both of these at a 2.5x resolution, which is going to max out the resolution on these displays. We're also going to play these games at the highest performance mode for each of them just to give us the best absolute performance, even though standard performance mode will probably play these games at full speed. Okay, so first thing you'll see is that yes, these games are going to play at full speed, no problem. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to put them in fast forward to see how fast they can go when I push them all the way. Now, with the frame cap off, I have seen consistently that the AYN Thor does about 10% better than the AYANEO Pocket DS. Now, that's not really going to matter that much when you're actually playing the game, because just at 100% speed, they're both going to play fine, but this one does seem to have a little bit better performance power. It's also worth noting that the temperatures are about the same as well, 77 degrees internally on the Thor, and then they break it out between CPU and GPU on the AYANEO, but it's 76 and 81, so very close between them. So what this says to me is that they're both going to play these games really well. Like, these are both excellent devices for playing high-end systems, but at least when it comes to PlayStation 2, it does look like the Thor has a little bit of an advantage, but not much. Let's do one more test, this time with F-Zero GX on Nintendo GameCube. I'm running these both at 3x resolution upscale and using the latest version of Dolphin, and this one's a little bit unique. What you can see at the top right, there is going to be an option that says max speed, and so even while playing this game at normal speed, you'll be able to see that it's going to have a higher percentage number. That basically says how fast it could go if it needed to. And what I found between these two is that the AYANEO Pocket DS is usually about 10% better. So again, we're kind of splitting hairs here. They're both going to play at 100% no problem, but on average, this one's going to play at like 170%, whereas this one will be about 180%. So again, what this means to me is that they are both excellent devices. They're going to be able to play these Gen 6 systems no problem. Same thing with stuff like Nintendo Switch and so on. So yes, they are both really good when it comes to performance, and it really depends on the emulator that you're using, the game that you're playing, but in general, yeah, they're kind of neck and neck, and sometimes one is better than the other, but it's really not worth splitting hairs. I guess the way that I would put it is that I would not really purchase either of these devices based on performance alone. I think it's all the other factors that mean a lot to me. So yes, these both have excellent performance. There are times when one is going to be better than the other, but I don't think those are the biggest determining factors between the two. Suffice to say, both of these are excellent for gaming, and I would recommend checking out the full reviews for each of them to see what they can do. So in terms of grading, I'm going to give them both an A, and I think that's pretty appropriate because there are some S-tier handhelds that are coming out here soon, like the Snapdragon 8 Elite or the G3 Gen 3. So they're not the absolute best devices that you can get right now. There is room for improvement, but they are awesome, so I'm going to give them an A. Okay, now let's talk about battery life, and it should be a pretty clear winner between the two. 6,000 milliamp hours on the Thor and 8,000 milliamp hours on the AYANEO Pocket DS, but surprisingly, it's actually pretty close. I did a couple different tests between the two. So for example, I played this game, New Super Mario Bros. 2 on 3DS for an hour, and I looked at the battery percentage. I started them both at 100% and watched how much they dipped, and surprisingly, they dipped the exact same amount. After 1 hour of gameplay on each, they both lost about 14% battery from 100%. So this says to me that they're about the same despite the AYANEO Pocket DS having a larger battery. And there's a couple things we can extrapolate from that. The AYANEO Pocket DS has larger displays. It might take more juice to power them. They also get brighter, so they might be more power hungry. In addition, the cooling on the AYANEO Pocket DS might take a little bit more juice as well, and so that's where the difference is coming from. I did the exact same test for an hour with PlayStation 2, and I got the same results, 15% battery draw with each. And so again, I think this means that despite having a larger battery, the AYANEO Pocket DS is more power hungry. To give you one last example, I've been recording this video for about an hour and a half at this point, and I've left these devices on the entire time, mostly on idle, just at like the balanced or the standard performance mode here, and at 50% brightness as I go through the menus and maybe show a game for a few seconds as I'm recording. And over that time period of an hour and a half, the AYN Thor is now at 91% battery from 100%, whereas the AYANEO Pocket DS is down to 74% battery at that same amount of time starting from 100%. So yes, this one just seems more power hungry. It's the larger screens, it's maybe the cooling fans, but something about this is causing to drain the battery faster than the AYN Thor. Now luckily, the AYANEO has a larger battery, and so it just kind of comes out at a wash most of the time when you're playing a game, but something to be mindful of is that numbers sometimes in battery sizes don't necessarily mean everything. So in this example, I'm going to give both of them a B grade. I think the battery life is still very good on each of them. I've never come to a point where I have to stop playing a game because the battery has drained. Usually I just top it up every night and I'm good to go. And so I see each of these battery scores as being good enough. I can play these games no problem, and despite the fact that the AYANEO Pocket DS has a larger battery, its battery life is about the same as the Thor. Next up, we're going to talk about the docked experience. Both of these devices are capable of video out via USB-C. The AYANEO Pocket DS has a ton of different resolution options when you have it plugged in, so no matter what you're plugging it into, you probably can find a resolution that will match your display. And the way this works is it's just going to mimic whatever's happening on the top display, so you can basically consoleize this device and play it on a larger display if you would like. There are also options in the settings to turn off the display when you have it plugged in too, so you can do all of that as well. The one thing I don't like about the AYANEO Pocket DS is that when you close it, it goes to sleep. Even if you have it plugged in or try to unplug it and plug it back in, there's no way to actually play this device when you have the lid closed. Now the Thor also has other resolution options, not as many as the AYANEO, but it has all the standards, 1080p, 1440p, and 4K at different refresh rates. And this one does the same thing as well, where it will output to the top display into your monitor, and you can also go into the settings and turn this off as well, so that the screen is not going to be showing on the device, but only on your monitor or TV. When you close this one up, it also will go to sleep, but you can tap on that power button on the shell, which will wake it back up, and then you can play on this with the lid closed. And if you've got it set up that when plugged into an external monitor, it keeps the internal screens turned off, that's going to be an excellent setup. Right now I've got it set up so that all the screens are going to be on, which means that even when it's closed, the screens are turned on. So this is just one settings tweaked, but yes, this one feels a little bit more consoleizable because I can do it with the display closed. And so I think the docked experience on both is decent. You can play this hooked up to a Bluetooth controller on a bigger TV and really enjoy it. But I am going to give the Thor a slight advantage here because you can do it with the lid closed, which I think is just a cleaner look overall. Okay, next up we have what I'm calling the buying experience. Like, what is it like to purchase this and what does the aftercare support look like? Let's start with the Thor first. So you can just go on the AYN website and you can purchase it directly from them, and they are shipping right now. There's a slight delay right now just because there's such high demand for it. So, there might be a couple weeks that you're waiting until it actually ships, but as it stands right now, it's available, and once you purchase it, it'll be shipped to you. In addition, there are a ton of different accessories you can buy for your Thor. They've got a TPU grip, a lanyard, some screen protectors, a pouch, a carrying case, and all these can be found on their store, including with an accessories pack for a discount. And I personally did pick up their accessories pack. I just got it the other day. So that comes with a TPU grip. You can get this in different colors. We have the TPU shell. I showed this off in my review video. And then they've got stuff like a soft bag that you can use if you want to kind of just put it directly in that. And then they have screen protectors both for the top and the bottom, which is great. And then you also have a carrying case. You can get one that will work with the TPU grip or one without. So you've got the option there. And then finally, you've got this lanyard too. So lots of different accessories that you can buy for this device. It feels like there's a whole ecosystem directly on their website. Another nice thing on the website is a tab called Shipping Dashboard. So here you can look day by day and see which orders are going to be shipped out. So you can get an idea of when your order is going to be shipped. And so I like the level of communication that you get from AYN. It feels like I'm well taken care of altogether between the different accessories and the fact that it's shipping right now. And even though there is a delay, I can check that with the Shipping Dashboard. They've also got a 15-day return policy. So if you end up getting the device and you don't like it, you can send it back to them. I think you'll have to pay the return shipping, but other than that, you'll get a refund. And if there's any sort of defect or damage to the device, they ask for you to contact them and they will work it out. And I've heard a lot of good stories of people having a pretty good experience with getting a return when there is something wrong with their handheld. Now, the buying experience of the AYANEO Pocket DS is slightly different. Number one, they initially had all their pre-orders on Indiegogo, and so you had to order it from here, and the expected shipping was October for all of these pre-orders. However, here we are a month after shipping was supposed to start, and most people have not received their device yet. They're starting to trickle in, but the majority don't have theirs yet. Now, since then, they have moved all of the sales over to their website, and they're now saying that shipping is going to start in mid-December, which I assume is for all the orders that are taking place right now. So there is going to be a bit longer of a delay when it comes to the AYANEO Pocket DS, and even those who had pre-ordered it several months before the Thor came out, they are still waiting for theirs too. As far as accessories, there are only two things in their shop right now. There's a carrying case for this device as well as a similar one called the Flip 1S, and then they also have a screen protector for the bottom screen only on the AYANEO. So it doesn't have that same accessories ecosystem that we saw with the AYN Thor, but this is really just a minor complaint. Now, as far as return policy, it's kind of hard to understand what's happening on the AYANEO website. They don't have like a 15-day return window as far as I can tell. So once you buy the thing, if you don't like it, I don't think they allow you to refund it. However, they do say on their website there's a 1-year warranty for their hardware in case something goes wrong with it. And in general, they just say to contact them if something goes wrong. At the end of the day, I wouldn't say that either of these devices are going to be a perfect experience compared to like, returning it on Amazon or just dropping into a mom and pop store and making an exchange. But in general, I think the buying experience of the AYN Thor is a lot better than the AYANEO Pocket DS. It's going to ship more quickly, and they've also got more accessories and a clearer return and refund and support window too. Okay, so the last section is going to be very subjective and kind of a wild card, and that's going to be the fun factor. Like, which device am I playing more? And, I've had each of these for about a month, if not more at this point, and I have found that I'm using the AYN Thor more often. I mentioned it earlier, but I went on a trip to Japan. I took this device with me, and it was a perfect travel companion just because, it's a clamshell, so I can close it up and throw it in my bag and then pull it out when I need to, and it's kind of a nondescript handheld. I think most people probably thought I was playing on a 3DS, but I was playing so much more. And so for me, that's a major fun factor consideration, that this is a device that I can take around with me and I can have it in more scenarios, and it's just a lot of fun to use. Now that being said, the AYANEO Pocket DS is still a very good handheld. It's very impressive. I love these huge displays too. In fact, as I was preparing for this video, I went and I, updated all the emulators on this device and made sure that everything was working properly. And just the evening that I spent prepping this device was just so fun because these screens are so big. So even after spending time with the AYN Thor, I was still very impressed by the overall gaming experience on the AYANEO Pocket DS. But I think when it comes to the fun factor here and which device I'm going to grab and play more often, I think the proof is in the pudding because I've been playing the AYN Thor about twice as much as the AYANEO Pocket DS over the past month or two. And I think that as of 2025, when it comes to dual screen Android-based handhelds, it just doesn't get any better than the AYN Thor right now. So I'm going to give that a top tier score. It's an S tier here, whereas the AYANEO Pocket DS is still an excellent experience, and I'm going to give it an A. So when we tally all the scores together, it's kind of a bloodbath. The AYN Thor scores 47 compared to 41 on the AYANEO Pocket DS. But I think the number one thing to bear in mind here is that both of these scores are very high when you consider all the different factors that we're talking about here, the different categories. Each of them are scoring very high. It's just that the Thor is scoring a little bit higher in many of the others. So when putting this all together, I think that it's a pretty clear winner for me in my own subjective opinion, but I hope I've given you enough information here to decide which one is going to be the best fit for you. The way I would put it is if you mostly plan on playing at home and you want a big screen experience and something that's just out of the box more comfortable, then the AYANEO Pocket DS is an excellent fit. But if you're looking for something more on the go and more just kind of enhanced in many different use case scenarios, then I would say the AYN Thor is the better all around. Let me know what you think in the comments down below. Did you pick up one of these? Which one did you pick? And do you agree with these scores that I have? If you don't agree, I'd love to hear what you would have scored and why. As always, thank you for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.